Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So this week, at the time of this recording, I'm very excited because in my extroverted thinking, 10-year-old or tertiary process is excited because for the first time in almost a decade of doing Personality Hacker, we finally set up a whiteboard, a Scrum board here in our studio/offices. And I'm super excited because I don't know if you know what a Scrum board is, if you're listening, but basically it's a project management, task management system, and we have a very, very simple version of it. But I'm so excited because finally we're getting ourselves organized to where we can have 3 columns on a whiteboard: the to-do column, the doing column, and the done column. And this might sound like, are you kidding me, Joel? Are you really excited about this? And I genuinely am because it's been a struggle for us as perceivers to do work here in our business. It's hard to get on a rhythm. It's hard to get a schedule. It's hard to get traction on things. We tend to work in sprints. We tend to create a project or an opportunity, and then we just work 12, 14-hour days for 3 to 6 weeks, killing ourselves, and then we just collapse, and then we don't do anything for 4 weeks, and then we do it again, another project.
Or to be fair, a fire. We create a fire.
We create our own fires. Yeah, we create our own emergencies to have to get us into action. It's really crazy.
And because having a fire is so effective for us, it's hard for us to do the smart thing, which is stop relying on fires that we create, which is anxiety producing and causes so much stress, and maybe get ahead of the game and do things like hang up Scrum boards so we can look at a list of our to-do items and track whether or not they're complete and done. And there are so many times where we've sat down at meetings and had all these projects listed out and okay, we're absolutely going to do this. This is what we're going to be doing. And maybe we'll have that meeting, I don't know, let's say it's on a Thursday, and then Friday we end up being caught up in other stuff. And then by the time Monday rolls around, I'll sit down to my desk and be like, what did we talk about on Thursday?
What are we supposed to be working on?
It's almost so embarrassing I don't want to ask. And so I don't. And then I just spend Monday trying to remember what we talked about on Thursday and looking for my notes. And I have so many notebooks of notes. It could be literally any of them. And so therefore, I never find what we talked about on Thursday. And I'm kind of mildly embarrassed and I don't want to ask. And then eventually I find out when somebody says, hey, did you finish that thing? And I'm like, yeah, I totally finished that thing. And then I'll stay up all night finishing it. So that's so much a way that we've been working for so long that this year we decided, okay, enough of this. We're going to get our act together. We're going to be judgers. We're going to be more like judgers. So we've been employing our 10-year-old or tertiary function. For me, it's extroverted feeling or harmony. And for Joel, it's extroverted thinking or effectiveness. And we've been just rigorous with ourselves. And I think because of this, we've also ended up pulling on our inferior function, our 3-year-old function of introverted sensing or memory a lot as well, since that is the thing that creates what we call our rhythm. So I didn't spend this summer very productivity minded, which is always how I try to think in terms of. I always try to think in terms of okay, what can I get accomplished? This summer, I spent 3 months thinking in terms of getting a schedule down. And it didn't matter whether or not I was productive or effective. That was basically my mentality all summer. I'm going to get a schedule down. I'm going to figure this out. And I don't really care what the byproduct is that is, or the productivity byproduct. I'm just going to focus on nailing this down. And what I noticed is, of course, in true perceiver fashion, I just threw a lot of spaghetti against the wall. And I started with, and this is unsurprising to anybody who's had a 5-minute conversation with me lately, I started with health. I was like, okay, I've got 10, 15 pounds I got to lose. I've had this 10 or 15 pounds on me for who knows how long. Probably, I can tell you when, Piper, right? She's 7 years old now. I should have gotten this handled a long time ago. And I'm like, okay, so I'm going to do this. This is what is happening. I'm going to get this 15 pounds off. And I'm going to start with diet and I'm going to start with exercise. And so I focused in on getting my nutrients handled, my schedule of when I was going to eat, how I was going to eat, getting that down, and then adding whatever my schedule of working out was going to be. But I didn't have that piece locked in. I just didn't know. I had some ideas, but whenever I would put it on the schedule of when I was going to work out, it would never happen. It was like something would get in the way. So I just opportunistically went to like yoga classes. I tried probably half a dozen different time periods, and I just kept going at sporadic random times until I found the time that worked the best for me and the yoga instructor that worked the best for me, and then I was able to nail that down. So now it's Wednesday and Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Okay, so now I have my yoga times in place. And then I added to that when I was going to go to the gym. And that was also sporadic. Sometimes I go in the morning, sometimes really late at night. Then we figured out the best time to go is when Piper's in karate lessons. And so we ended up now going at, whatever time she goes for her karate lessons. I think it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or something else, something like that. Anyway, none of this is particularly interesting, but the point of all of this is that I kept trying to figure it out until I got a rhythm. And once I got a rhythm, then I got a schedule. So Joel and I were talking about this phenomenon of schedule versus rhythm and which direction it goes, whether or not you're a judger or a perceiver. And our observation has been that for judgers, they create the schedule first, and then the rhythm comes from observing the schedule. But I suspect it's the opposite for perceivers. I think for perceivers, the rhythm comes first, and then the schedule organizes around it.
I would say that's definitely for us. Now, you listening, if you're a perceiver, you might have an external judger-like schedule projected onto you by your work, your 9-to-5 job, maybe your family schedule, like whatever's going on, your kid's school schedule. There might be elements you have to be beholden to. We've created a life, Antonia, where we could literally make up any schedule we want. In fact, there have been times when you've been on coaching calls in Australia at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, we have to do what we've got to do, running a global digital business, that our schedule sometimes has to be very flexible. But I think when you're building it from the ground up, I agree with you. I think that rhythm comes first for us as perceivers, because if we try to externalize a schedule from our own selves of something we want, and we say, we're going to be beholden to that. Every single time I try to do that, I fail. Like every time I try to set an outside schedule out there, I end up being way over idealistic on what I'm going to be able to do, how it's going to go, like set it and forget it forever. And like within like 3 days, it breaks down and I'm not following what I've set up for myself at all. And so I think this whole rhythm idea is really interesting to catch the way that I'm naturally showing up and then build my schedule around that. Now, again, mileage varies because we have the opportunity to do that in our lives. And I would say, in some ways, that's also a blessing and a curse. This summer, it's taken us 3 to 4 months to get this kind of down at all. And I still would say we're still struggling with it. And it's probably been one of the hardest personal growth projects we've done in memory. There's been some really challenging ones we've dealt with in the last decade. But this, in some ways, has been more destabilizing for us, causing more friction and arguments and disagreement. And it's really, really tough for us as two EPs to get this schedule thing down. And that rhythm has helped so much because now I have kind of this, it's almost a cadence of my life now, a daily or weekly cadence I'm creating. I'm like, okay, I'm getting this. This feels internal. This feels organic. This feels like I'm on this cadence or rhythm of life. Okay. Now we can start putting some codification around it. Now I'll schedule things around that now.
I think one of the reasons why it's also been so difficult for me is that I grew up having an external schedule placed upon me in everything, not just in schooling, but almost every minute of my life was accounted for in the previous incarnation of my life, like with my religious upbringing. And so when I became an adult, I've had nothing but a series of 9-to-5 jobs, or actually 8-to-5 is really the modern job. Nothing but just decades of 8-to-5 jobs. And I guess not decades. I guess I'm not quite that old. And I started PH about 10 years ago, and I'm only 41. So at least 10 to 15 years. And because of that, I outsourced my schedule in anything that had to do with making money in order to survive. So all the survival stuff ended up being outsourced to somebody else to create a schedule that I had to plug myself into. And then anything in my discretionary time, anything that was optional that I wanted to do, like working out and that sort of thing, I just had a really, really difficult time of creating any sort of schedule around that. And it was very haphazard. Because I didn't have kids throughout my 20s and early 30s, that was much easier because I could do things whenever I wanted to. I wasn't beholden to anybody else. And so, like, if I came home from work and I wanted to go work out, instead of make dinner for, for my ex-husband and I, we usually just kind of fended for ourselves most times, it didn't really matter. But as soon as kids entered the situation and as soon as a family entered the situation, all that, maybe all of the discretionary time got sort of sucked out until they got old enough to be a little bit more independent. And so now I'm in a time period which is really interesting. Before, everything was set up for me. And when everything was set up for me, it was easy to mindlessly have a schedule and just go, okay, well, I'm just obeying the schedule that's given to me. And then when I had discretionary time as I got a little older, I had so much independence, it just kind of didn't matter what I did. Then I moved into a time period of having total control over my schedule, but then having all of these responsibilities and all these things that I was beholden to. And I think that's when things really went off that's when they flew off the map, because I hadn't really built any tools to be able to create my own schedule. I just obeyed one. And I had been used to being so independent for so long that I could do anything I wanted to whenever I did have discretionary time. So really mastering this idea of creating my own schedule and enforcing it, and then having that schedule accommodate so many needs and so many people who may or may not like what's going on, and then I have to that creates resistance, and you have to fight, and you have to try to figure this all out. I think that's why it's been such a challenge. And I think we're going to probably be speaking primarily to perceivers here, and then anybody who's a judger in a relationship with a perceiver. Because I think judgers are almost always baffled by why this is such a struggle for perceivers to deal with. Like, just have a schedule, just create a schedule and stick with it. But like you said, I think one of the problems that I'm almost always dealing with when I have a schedule is that I'm unrealistic about how much I can get done. I squeeze too much in. I just overestimate how much I can get done in any given time. And then once something interrupts it, now I'm just behind. I'm behind for so long then, and behind the 8 ball for so long, I end up abandoning the schedule because it just feels so uncomfortable.
I think it is confusing for judgers because basically when you have a judging function, like for example, you and I, Antonia, our judging function, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling for both of us is at the tertiary 10-year-old level. That means it's less developed than our introverted judging functions. And when it's higher up in your stack, an extroverted judging function is higher up in your stack, you're able to plot projects and tasks on a longer timeline. So on a short timeline, we're good. In a sprint, in a weekend, in maybe a week when it's all intensity, all focus on that one project or a few projects and tasks, we're pretty good. But the longer that timeline goes on, it's harder for us to keep track of what's happening over a long period of time. And so that's where the schedule, the rhythm comes in. I would also say that a perceiver moving from a schedule that's external, like a 9-to-5 job, and a lot of people, you listening might be one of these people, have left a career or job situation where it was done for you. You might have branched out on your own as an artist, a creator, a musician, an online writer, podcaster yourself, whatever. And for perceivers, it's kind of like that scene in The Shawshank Redemption when the one prisoner who's in his 80s finally gets released from prison on parole after spending his entire life in the prison, the Shawshank prison, and he has no idea how to make it in the real world because he was told when to go to the bathroom, when to go to bed, when to get up. And now he's like, I'm totally lost. He actually commits a crime to get put back in prison because he can't live in the outside because he's so confused on how life works.
I thought he killed himself.
We're spoiling a lot for this. If you haven't seen the movie. No, it's fine. I mean, it's a 20-year movie, 25-year-old movie.
Spoiler alert for a 3-decade-old movie.
I think when he can't get put back in prison, that's when he ends up taking his life because he can't do it. Like they're like, we're not going to put you back in. I think he ends up killing himself. I think that's what he does. But he actually originally tries to commit some kind of crime to either, or maybe it's to stay in before he gets paroled or something. And they're like, come on, we're letting you out. And then he just can't make it. He just can't make it on the outside. Anyway, the point is, that's an illustration to, I think, how perceivers feel when we leave our 9-to-5 job. It's like we got let out of Shawshank prison and we're like, am I allowed to just how does this work? Well, you're a little confused sometimes. And so you can either fall back onto your old patterns of your old schedule, or probably as a perceiver, one of the reasons you left what you're doing in the first place is to have more control over your life, have more options, have more creativity, have more input into your day. But now you're challenged with not getting as much done, or frustrated, or taking on too much responsibility, or overscheduling what you can do in a given amount of time. And that can be really challenging for us as perceivers.
I think there's a lot of idealism around the around having your own schedule or making your own schedule for perceivers. Like, I mean, to piggyback off of your Shawshank metaphor, there's a sense that once you get out of your day job, if you have any sort of entrepreneurial spirit or you want to go work on your own, it really does feel like you may have just dug your way out of prison with a spoon. Like, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm free. I can do anything I want to. And I think for perceivers, there's a lot of wisdom in the idea of going back to a schedule, like realizing that, because for me, when I don't have one, when I don't have a rhythm that ends up in a schedule, I don't get anything done. I feel like I'm spinning my wheels all the time. I'm always playing catch up somehow. I never get space to have, like creativity. Like we talk about this a lot. In fact, we kind of sometimes get frustrated and argue about this idea of, in the moment when we're supposed to be, maybe recording a podcast, like right now today, you were in this total creative flow. Before we recorded the podcast, you were in this creative flow about a business funnel that you were working on. And I'm like, we have to go record the podcast. And you're like, oh, like I want to stay in my creative flow. And the reason why we're recording the podcast today is because we actually missed the time that we have scheduled to record the podcast a few days ago. And so now we're making it up, and we're making it up in a time period where you're in a creative flow. So now it just feels like a task, not a pleasure. Whereas if we were recording it in the time period we have scheduled per week to record the podcast, it wouldn't feel that way. Like if you had creative flow, that would be like, yeah, but I can do that later because this is the time we record the podcast. So it's almost like your mind understands that there are appropriate and inappropriate times depending upon whether or not it's lining up with that schedule. So there's a lot of wisdom in having a schedule as a perceiver, because when you have a schedule and you set things in and you have these anchor points, when you have creative flow, you got the stuff handled you were supposed to do. And so now you have all that freedom to be creative. You're not now in an 11th hour situation where you're scrambling to do something that you were supposed to do a few days ago, but you didn't, and now you have to do it and interrupt that time period of creativity.
Yeah, I think Charis, our chief of staff, INFJ Charis, who works with us, thought I was messing with her 3 days ago. We were on our way to go see a movie together in the evening, and I was like, okay, Charis, you're a judger. You have this tight schedule. You miss a morning of doing something. How do you reschedule the next day? Do you push it to, like, it's a timeline thing? When we missed the podcast this past week, this actually came up for me. And I was like, and I think she was like, are you messing with, like, I was asking such simple, basic, almost childlike questions about how to time manage. I think she thought I was like teasing her or something, but I was genuinely asking, like, how do you as a judger get a sense of this rhythm? This is kind of where this conversation came from, that conversation with Charis, and like trying to figure out how to, because we have increasingly, one of the reasons we had to get our schedule down this summer is we have increasing responsibilities coming on our shoulders. Just every week it feels like a new responsibility is coming, not just the business, but personal life, my kids, just a bunch of stuff's changing in our lives a lot. So we both woke up and said, we can't live so freeform anymore. We've got to get structured and disciplined. Our daughter's 7. She's now in school. Like there's a lot of stuff happening now that's like starting to keep us accountable, and we have to get organized. But man, it's tough. Like it's been an emotional experience. And then the other part for me has been emotional in that we're starting to get this schedule down, and I'm starting to get panicked. Oh my God, I'm never going to be free ever again in my life. Like I'm struggling with this piece. Like we've got a pretty good schedule laid out, and we're holding to it pretty well. As emotional as that is, or as tough as that is for us, we're doing okay. But now I'm starting to I can feel the self-sabotage coming up. I want to sabotage the schedule. Like my EP, we talk about the firm model back in several podcasts ago, and even further back than that, around how all EPs want freedom, unfettered freedom. That's a fixation of mine. And I'm starting to panic a little bit. And if you're an EP, I'm sure you resonate with this. You're like, oh no, I'm going to be stuck with my own self-created prison. The more responsibility, more schedule I have, I'm never going to be free ever again. If something catches my fancy, if I see some shiny new object, I will not be able to pursue my bliss because I've got myself so scheduled and so routinized and so disciplined. So I am now struggling with that self-sabotage or that schedule sabotage coming up. And if you're a perceiver, this might be something you deal with as well. You may unconsciously be sabotaging your schedule or your system you have set up because you're fearful you might be stuck in it.
Yeah, and I think IPs fear that all the color is taken out of their life because they can't go with they're forced to do things that they don't want to have to do. They're not motivated to do them just because they're on the schedule. That's not motivating. I think for judgers, if something's on the schedule, it's almost like putting pen to paper.
That is the motivation, right?
That's the motivation, right? It's now in the external world. It lives out there, and the motivation is to get it taken off of the task list. Perceivers, I think we almost have to train ourselves to care about crossing something off of a to-do list. I do think that people with extroverted thinking or effectiveness anywhere in their car, right, or in their cognitive function stack, I think extroverted thinking people just inherently enjoy the act of crossing something off of a to-do list more than anybody who's got extroverted feeling.
Well, I found I like the sticky notes on my laptop. I like taking it, tearing it up, and throwing it in the trash.
Yeah, crumpling it up.
That's my feeling of like, I accomplished this thing.
Yes. Whereas I think for me, when I see that concept of writing something down just to cross it off is baffling to me. And I when people are like, does that feel really good to cross something off your list? I'm like, well, just having to have a list to begin with was that was a compromise. So just having to have a list of things already is like just mildly disgruntling. And so I don't think I feel any sort of satisfaction of crossing something off a list. But crumpling the whole paper up and throwing it away, there is something cathartic about that. But that's not because I accomplished a bunch of stuff. It's because I never have to look at that list ever again. So I get to like banish it from my sight. But I think for me, this idea of that unfettered freedom fixation, which of course all of the fixations in the firm model, they're unreasonable fixations. Like there's no such thing as unfettered freedom. It just doesn't exist. And so this idea that the schedule is going to become a prison, it's going to become a master, and you can't do anything about it, and now you're beholden to it. I've had to really re-perspective myself away from that concept and understand that actually it's a facilitator. The schedule facilitates me doing the things I want to do. Because if I just have unfettered freedom, it is very rare that I want to sit down and do work. I mean, sometimes I do. Sometimes I'm in a creative flow and I'm like, yes, I've got all these ideas for the business and let's go talk about them. But I wouldn't say that's like so, that doesn't work like clockwork. It doesn't get me up at 8 a.m. and gives me a full 8 hours boost until I'm like satisfied that I worked on the business all day. And there are probably people out there, personality types that are super into business. And so that is motivating for them. But I'm just kind of, I'm beyond that, if that makes sense. Like we've been running this business long enough that the honeymoon period is over. And so all the excitement about just owning your own business it's not there. Now it has to be about results. Now it has to be about, it has to be about doing what needs to be done in order to get a mission accomplished or the thing that I ultimately want to have accomplished. And so now I have to be a lot more results oriented. I have to be more focused on the end game in order to motivate myself. And so because I don't want to come do all this all the time, and there's always, when you run a business, or even if you're not running a business, just life in itself, everybody's life throws them a ton of stuff they don't want to have to do. All of us do, because we all have to be all things to all people, right? Or at least we believe that and set ourselves up in that situation a lot. And because we have to do all the stuff we don't particularly want to do, one of the best ways to ensure that those things get done so they're not hanging like an anvil over you all the time is to put it on a schedule. And the best way to schedule stuff you don't like to do or don't want to do is to have anchor points of the things that you enjoy. And those anchor points are things that then help create that rhythm as a perceiver, which then, of course, blooms into a schedule. So I think for perceivers, those of us trying to get ourselves into a schedule, I think the first thing we have to do is make peace that a schedule must exist. And not just one that we've outsourced, because that's easy. It's easy to go, okay, my job is 8 to 5, so I have to go there. But what are you doing in your evening hours? What are you doing on your weekends? If you're doing shift work, like that's even more tough because a schedule is created for you and it's haphazard usually. And what do you do with all the time? I mean, shift work is so hard to get anything accomplished because you're just kind of trying to schedule your life around this unpredictable, sort of set of hours that you're trying to maintain. So what do you do when you're in that kind of situation? And I've noticed that perceivers have a tendency to be in shift work a lot because it almost feels like it suits them more because it's not as routinized. But then, of course, you're not getting nearly as much done. So all that time that you're trying to get things done, I think for me, one of the number one things I did is I just made peace with this idea of a schedule. Like I was never going to have unfettered freedom. And I rolled over and just made peace with it. I just exposed my belly to the thoughts. I was like, okay, all right, schedule. I understand you have to exist. Now what? And then I think the second thing was realizing that the schedule doesn't have to hurt. It can actually accommodate me. It doesn't have to be something I'm shoehorning myself into. It doesn't have to be a square peg in a round hole. I can find a rhythm of things that work for me and then craft my schedule around it. And that was a huge aha.
I think shifting from a schedule being something that's put on us to seeing it as a platform for opportunity. It's a platform just like any other platform. It's a platform like an online service or a platform like a utility at our house. It's a utility of sorts. It's a platform for us to build our lives, our business, our creativity off of. So I think that can be a really powerful shift. I also think that in some ways I've noticed that judgers actually appear more flexible with schedules than perceivers in a lot of ways. Now, you might be a perceiver going, what? Are you kidding me? Or even a judger going, what? Are you kidding me? But it seems like as perceivers, we have a hard time making adjustments to schedule. Or let me put it a different way. When we make adjustments, like one adjustment, that means all adjustments are on the table often. And so we get more militant about not making adjustments. Whereas judges are like, oh, I missed that meeting. I'll just reschedule it over here. Perceivers are like, I missed that meeting. My whole week screwed up, and I guess I'll have to just redesign my life now. Like it's almost like it's so dramatic, at least for me as a perceiver. And I've seen other perceivers do this, maybe not in schedule as much, but we have a friend who's an INFP who keeps her house militant, like nothing's out of place. And it looks almost like a judging primary, like an extroverted thinking person lives in this house because it's so impeccably taken care of. But the only way she can do that is be so militant, you can't even move a pair of shoes like from one side of the entryway to the other, or the whole house will probably be, destroyed or upheavaled everywhere.
No, she lives alone. So she's able to maintain that level of militance, but she lives alone for a reason. And that is because if anybody disrupts anything, it's just everything goes off the rails.
All bets are off. And I think that's kind of how perceivers sometimes look at schedule. I certainly do. Once I miss something, it's almost like the whole week. I can't get to the next thing until that. It's almost sequential. Again, this is my extroverted thinking probably at a 10-year-old level. It's almost like sequential though. It like screws everything up. And now that one piece of thing I didn't do is like floating. It's hard to put it after stuff that it was supposed to become before. And I look at like Cheris on our team or other judges and they're like, oh, I'll just place it over here. And I'm like, how are you so flexible with your life and time? You're supposed to be a judger. You're supposed to be militant. But weirdly enough, it kind of manifests opposite, at least for the people in my life and myself. I don't know if you've identified with this at all, Antonia, in that experience.
Yeah, well, I think when you're trying to gain mastery over something, the pendulum swings to the other side, and you've got to be militant about it because there's no, it's like the better you get at something, the more you know what rules you can break. I think the challenge when perceivers try to get organized and scheduled is that they're not 100% sure which rules are allowed to be broken. And so then none of the rules can break. The other challenge is we also, or at least I, have a tendency to drift, right? It's like if one thing is off, even if it's not so destabilizing now everything is up for debate, if one thing is off, sometimes I don't really notice it that much until like another thing now is off. And then now another thing is off. And it creates all this drift. And so in order to... because I know that about myself now. In early days, I just allowed drift to happen, and drift was a huge problem, like schedule drift. Now, because I know that about myself, I have that militant nature because I don't want the drift to happen. And so, like I mentioned, yoga is Wednesday mornings and Saturday mornings. Well, I didn't hit Saturday morning this week at 9 a.m., and I'm really scared. I'm scared I'm never going to go back to yoga. Like it's a legit fear of mine. And I'm like, I have to go the next time. I have to. And a part of me is like, well, I'll just make it up. But I almost don't want to make it up because I'm afraid that if I make it up, now that's my get out of jail free card if I miss again. And so it's almost like I want to punish myself for having missed it.
I feel the same way about the podcast. That's so weird.
Right, exactly. It's like I never want to record another podcast ever again because we missed recording it.
Or it's like I don't want to make it easy to make up. I want to make it really hard to make it up. So I punish myself to make sure that I don't let it happen again in the future.
Right, it's totally irrational, by the way. Punishing yourself around this kind of thing is just ridiculous. But it's like it's because it's such a struggle. And I think to go back to some of the things that what I've tried to do to get in this place, which it sounds like we're still struggling. I think closer to what is true is that for the first time, it's not a major struggle.
Yeah.
For the first time, we actually are in a schedule that is working well enough that it's almost eerie. It's almost like we've fought more right now when the schedule is working around it because it's such a delicate thing. We're afraid we're going to break it or something. And so we get anxious. We're like, but it's working.
So true.
Don't touch it. Oh, you touched it. Don't touch the schedule because it's working. Oh my God. Are you trying to hurt the schedule, Joel? Are you trying to hurt the schedule? Like, don't hurt the schedule. It's working. And so there's this like anxiety around for both of us around the other person not honoring the schedule because for the first time ever, it feels hammered in. So we're talking as if it's still a struggle, but I think the struggle is now just making peace with the fact that we might, maybe at the ages of 41, well, you're not quite 41 and I'm not quite 42, but we're almost there. In our early 40s, we might have actually not mastered. We're still freshmen at it, but we might have actually entered a space where a schedule is happening and we're not going to break it. And that's an amazing thing. And I think, again, making peace with it, rolling over, exposing my belly to it and going, okay, I make peace. I hand myself over to you, schedule. And
so shifting from it being something that's trouble to a platform, to something that's enabling you to actually execute on your life, get things done, keep you going, like you see it in a good light now.
Exactly. And then realizing that it can accommodate me. I don't have to accommodate it. I mean, it has to exist, but I actually have some power and some privilege around this. Like I get to say how I want it to be. That's amazing. And even if I was working full time still, like an 8 to 5, I would still have the ability to make decisions around that, right? Like in what I do in my discretionary time. So that's a big aha, is that it's not this thing that I have to shoehorn myself into. And I think another piece of it is that it's working. It's working. So it took 3 months for this rhythm to turn into a schedule. And it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And I don't feel like I was particularly effective during that time period. But now that I look back, I lost those 10 pounds. I'm now a lot more, I'm getting a lot more done. I have like my pantry's cleaned out. We cleaned out our garage. Like our mudroom is cleaned out. Like we're getting all this stuff done. Now, of course, those are all extroverted feeling harmony things. They're not necessarily business oriented. But for me, I'm very sated. I'm like super happy that stuff has happened. And now that I'm turning my attention more, now that I've got that schedule set and I'm turning my attention more to the business, I'm getting so much more done there too. So I think it's also something that requires some patience to have it prove to you that it can work, but you have to have some faith. Like you have to roll over and realize it can serve you and have faith in it. And then eventually I think it pans out.
Yeah, well, and during that same time period, business-wise, we also set up a studio, an actual video audio studio for the first time. I mean, we've had kind of makeshift studios for the last almost decade where we just set up mics in a room and makeshift a studio. And now we have an actual place we go to record. The mics are set up all the time in like a little closet. And then right outside there, we have a video set up where we can shoot live video, which we're going to start a new video show, which will also have to be on a schedule. And that's going to be new for us to have to show up live on a regular basis, on a weekly basis for a season of episodes. We're going to have a live call-in show. So this is something that the schedule now, working on this, is enabling us to connect with you listening more. So because you're going to be getting the benefit of us creating a live, coordinated live show. In the past, we've been able to do a lot of things asynchronously, record them any time of the day or week, wherever we are in the world, and then release them. And now we're getting a little bit more synchronous where we're doing live material. So we have to get organized in order to deliver on that too.
And I think on the business side, I mean, I kind of forget how much we've gotten accomplished. I think, man, we didn't get anything done this summer. That's also a perceiver challenge. We don't always catalog what we have accomplished. And so we have a tendency to not, like, to wonder what we did with our time. Did we just waste our time? And then when I look back, I'm like, you're right, we did build a studio this summer. So we've actually done quite a bit. And I think recognizing those things and sort of celebrating them, I think is a big piece of also being willing to create that schedule. And in the business side, what we did is we also created anchor things. Our Profiler training course, which used to be 100% digital and online, it's worked out so much better as a live event that we ended up implementing a live event every November in LA. It might change in the future, but at the time of this recording, we've done the last few in LA in November.
With California taxes, it's going to definitely be changing.
Yeah.
It's like 32% taxes on this. It's ridiculous.
It's insane. We'll probably end up going to Vegas, but so we've been doing that. And then because it worked out so well and because our classes were getting bigger, we decided to do a second one per year. And then just this last year, we ended up having our first one on the East Coast in DC in May. And so which I think will probably get kicking to June. But basically, we have these two anchor events, these two Profiler training live anchor events, and everything in the business now gets organized around them. And that's been so helpful. It's been so helpful to have anchoring events that now we're like, oh, well, now we know how to schedule things out because we know what's going on twice a year. And no matter what happens, those things will be happening twice a year. And so I think as a perceiver, that's been another thing that's been extremely helpful in getting schedules is finding anchor events. Yoga is Wednesday morning and Saturday morning. Those are anchor events. And Piper's karate, whenever those happens, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, those are anchor events. We don't change those. And then being flexible enough to figure out everything else around that, and then knowing those things will flex, like all the stuff that aren't anchor events, those things can flex and flow. That's been that little bit of freedom that we can infuse into this schedule. And the anchor events are part of what helps create that rhythm because I'm always going to do this. No, of course, those anchor events happened after we found our rhythm. It took some throwing spaghetti against the wall to figure out what would be the ideal. But once we had those ideals, we anchored them down and now everything gets organized around them. So I think as perceivers, anchor events are extremely important. And so finding those anchor events after you figure out your rhythm, again, the second principle was it can accommodate you. So don't force yourself into it. But once you find those anchor events that accommodate you, then just have everything organized around them. And I think that's been that's been a game changer for me.
Yeah, and obviously we have a very unique experience in that we're trying to build all this from scratch without much outside. Like our daughter doesn't go to an actual school with a schedule. Most people have daily anchor events with school starting at X time and work starting at X time. So if that's you, obviously you have some of those already pre-built. But these are some things to be thinking about. If you and your partner, let's say your romantic partner, life partner, one of you's a perceiver, one of you's a judger, it's probably good to have this in your head around, oh, I'm a judger. This is probably how my perceiver partner's mind is working. They're probably looking for more rhythm, more event-based rhythms around their life rather than like a daily carving everything into 5-10 minute chunks throughout an entire 24-hour period. Perceivers, our minds just don't work that way as much. We're more into the whole experience itself. It's not these carved out 10-minute chunks of our day, the way you judgers somehow process.
I like that as perceivers, we think they chunk things out in 10 minutes.
I don't know. That's
I'm sure it's not that tight.
Some are. I don't know. It's my perception of it, right? Everybody's got these down to seconds with stopwatches. I think my ENTJ friend, she does feel like that. You go to her house, she's almost at her stopwatch out. Okay, clean up now. Go, 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 go. Running her kids through all this stuff. And it's whoa, that's crazy. It's so timed and intense.
She's also the kind of person that as soon as you walk into her house, she's assigning you tasks. We're
also true.
We'll come over and visit you for the evening. She's like, great. And we show up and immediately I'm somehow tagging clothes for resale.
I know, folding laundry. So I'm how did I get this task put onto me?
How did this happen? I brought wine over. We were supposed to just talk. So I think there are some people out there like that. But if you're not one of those people, I think most judges are like, it's not.
Certainly.
It's not a 5 or 10 minute chunk. It's a little more reasonable than that.
And if you've got kids or you're in a responsive role, even as a judger, your life gets thrown out of whack constantly, right? Kid gets sick, this thing needs to happen this week. I'm sure, I mean, everybody's got a challenge with schedule and stuff of this nature. But I think this podcast particularly can help you if you're listening and you are on your own as a perceiver in particular, having to try to build something from scratch for yourself that can work. We've talked with people a lot, and sometimes perceivers struggle with really basic things around this, especially if they're on their own. I mean, you coached a kid, I call him a kid, he was probably early 20s, but a few years ago, he was an INTP, and you told me a little bit about the coaching session where you were just walking him through the basics of turning off his laptop, going to bed at night, getting up on a schedule. Like, it was, he wanted to do big things in the world, but you ended up focusing on the real simple basics because he was challenged with that as a perceiver, which I think we all are. So if you're in college, you're young, you don't have that external thing to keep you accountable yet, like a job or a really rigid schedule, and you're having to build that from the beginning. I think our recommendation is make peace with it. Schedule can be a benefit to you. It can be a platform to build your life off of, which can be really powerful. And I think we all resist it as perceivers. But the other thing is go with the rhythms of your life. Find anchor rhythms or anchor events that can rhythm this for you. And then a schedule can emerge. And it's going to be something that's sustainable that you actually hold to if it's a rhythm-focused thing, rather than trying to create something out of thin air.
And until you said it, I didn't realize how much it had helped us in our schedule. But a big one is that we don't give ourselves permission to stay up all night, which we're night owls. And so for a long time...
That's a tough one for me.
It's so tough. It was like we regularly went to bed at like 2 o'clock in the morning.
The house is quiet. I can read. I can watch something. I can literally do anything I want.
Yeah, it's like our alone time started at 11 o'clock at night. And so we'd stay up until 2, and we'd have to get up the next morning by, 7:38 to try to get our lives going. And it was always so tough. And so, like being conscientious about things with backlights, devices, shutting them down, getting good sleep, drinking plenty of water, having exercise, having a nutrient-rich diet, all of those things that just honor your body. And as intuitives, we're kind of idiots around this thing. Like it's like one of those things that when you're in your 40s, all of a sudden it hits you. It's like, oh, maybe I should take care of my body. That might be a thing. And so then now it's, now it's like a complicated task to be present and a complicated task to like feel your body talking to you. It's one of the ways in which intuitives are maybe the most idiotic. And we know that about ourselves. So it's not like I'm saying anything, out of the realm of like, there's an intuitive out there who's mastered it, who's like, hey, not me. And there's like every other intuitive that's like, yeah, you called it. And that's the challenge. So taking care of yourself and taking care of your body and taking care of your sleep schedule, having a clean room, right? Like, I think I heard somebody say, if you're trying to get productive as a mom, if you're like a stay-at-home mom, put your shoes on every day. Like, get up, get dressed, and put shoes on. And that just changes your mentality and puts you in a state of getting things handled. Well, there's a lot of little tricks you can do to get yourself into get up and get moving. But there's also tricks you can do to stay on a schedule. And I think those anchor events and those, making sure that you don't do too much drift. And maybe you do have to get kind of uptight about it at first because the pendulum is swinging to the other side. Maybe you have to get super uptight. But remember that your schedule will follow your rhythm. So you've got to find the rhythm first and then match the schedule to it. I think judgers, on the other hand, that concept of the schedule and then that becomes the rhythm. I think for them, the most important thing is to not have too much energy sapping elements in the schedule, like things they believe they have to do. We talk about at Disney. Well, I mean, we talk about it. You and I talk about it constantly, Joel. And I think I've heard, maybe we've talked about it in the podcast before, but I've heard other people mention this as a really good illustration for kind of going with the flow and not resisting it too hard. Which is this concept that when they were designing Disney, or Disneyland, there was a patch of grass that people kept walking through. And they had signs up that said, stay off the grass. And they were trying to really force people to get around this grass. But people just kept walking through it anyway. And it was causing a path that they didn't want. And it was very disruptive. And so when they asked Walt Disney, what to do about it, he goes, well, just pave it. If people want to walk through there, you're not going to stop them. You can put up as many ropes as you want and as many signs as you want. They're just going to walk through it. So just pave it and make it an official walkway. And I think for judges, sometimes the challenge can be that when they create a schedule, they create these sort of stay off the grass situations for themselves where they feel like they have to they have to force themselves in these schedules, and sometimes it's not very energy efficient. So for judgers, it's more like being thoughtful about their schedule and making sure that they give themselves permission to sort of quote unquote pave the place that they're going to be walking to anyway, and then then their rhythm ends up being more energy efficient. So I think that's one of the bigger the challenges for judgers, but I don't think judgers have nearly the challenge that perceivers do when it comes to creating a schedule. So I think we spent most of the time on the podcast going to perceivers like, we know it's really hard and we know it's a thing, and we wish you good luck, and here's some of the things that we've done in order to try to make it happen for ourselves.
So what do you think? You've been listening along. Are you a perceiver who has struggled with schedules? Are you someone who has a schedule given to you so you haven't had to really figure out your own? Have you had to figure out how to drive your life yourself, build your schedule from scratch, operate your days, weeks, and months and years on your own, and you've gotten success, and you're like, guys, I wish I had a microphone there because I would give you like 10 things that you could, discuss and talk about with the audience that I want to contribute, but I don't have a microphone. So what do I do? Well, here's what you do. You come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this show, share your 10, 20, 25 ideas. Share your story. Tell us where you're at in this experience. We want to hear from you. We want to know what's going on for you. And then other people, including ourselves, can benefit from those discussions. So come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this podcast, we want to hear from you.
And if you enjoyed it, the podcast that is, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. And of course, our book is available. It's called Personality Hacker. It's available in all major retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads for the book, that also helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.